I'd like to thank and welcome Nicola McAndrew and Karen McArdle for delivering and leading this next session for us. So during the session, Nicola will speak first and we'll do a 5 or so minute input around the policy landscape in CLD, policy and planning landscape in CLD. And Karen then will do some input on meaningful impact measuring evaluation, and particularly in relation to a book that she's been involved with other CLD colleagues in writing and having published. I'll get the sales pitch in now, Karen. I've got, and I will share it for you once the chat has started. I've got a link for 30% off the book until the end of December if you put in a code. So I'll put that in the chat if anyone wants to get it and support your fellow CLD authors. So I'll just invite Nicola to start off. Once they've both had an input, they'll have a chat for 5 minutes or so. Put any comments that you have in the chat, any questions you've got in the chat, and then we'll have a good 10 or 15 minutes once they've done their inputs to hopefully respond to some of the things that you're picking up from what they're saying. So Nicola, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, thumbs up. Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here, both in my role as a policymaker for Scottish Government, but also as a member of the CLD Standards Council myself. Marion had asked me to briefly, and that's not something I'm great at, but I'm going to try briefly talk about the work that the Scottish Government CLD policy team are doing at the moment, a little bit about our hopes and aspirations for CLD policy and undertaking that work, and then to talk quite briefly about the national strategies relating to CLD that we're working on and the guidance that is coming out to assist people with CLD planning next year, and to talk about how that's relevant for planning nationally and locally. So I'll give 5 minutes my best shot. I might not be able to get into a lot of detail in that time, but as Kirsty says, please add questions to the chat function because we'll be able to cover questions and comments after Karen and I have both done our bit in a wee bit more detail. So I'm assuming that most of you will have heard the Minister, Mr. Lockhead, yesterday talking about the 3 pieces of strategy work that we're engaged in at the moment. The youth work strategy, the adult learning strategy, and more recently, a framework for lifelong learning. And some of you will also be aware that prior to the pandemic, we were on track to publish the adult learning and youth work strategies just about now. So I suppose in terms of hopes, my very basic hope is that together with the sector, we can complete these pieces of work over the next few months and that nothing else comes in from left field as has happened with COVID-19 and throwing us off course. But more importantly, I hope that when these are published, they'll be received as a blueprint to support you in your local planning endeavours. And with that hope, it's not just that these strategies help you, but that they influence both you and others, people who aren't delivering CLD services or who are not a CLD organisation, but in fact in part of the wider education system, where professional CLD practice can be recognised as an equal partner with a very bespoke set of skills that have never been more needed than now. And for me, that's the main challenge, to create strategies that are meaningful, that are well connected at a national level, but that can be used at a local level to create those more inclusive learning journeys and opportunities that Alan was talking about before. I am aware that at a local level, it can feel like you just blink or turn away and all of a sudden there's a new national strategy that you're being asked to consider. But that's why the timing's quite good for these strategies, because next year, as many of you I'm sure are only too aware, it's time for the next round of CLD plans. So to support this and to support you with this, We've been working with Education Scotland and CLD Managers Scotland and the Standards Council and a group of other key stakeholders to develop guidance for this planning. This is anticipated to publish next week. Now, the guidance draws on the learning that's happened to date. So primarily that's from the previous CLD plan reviews that you may have seen, and also from the findings of the inspection evidence report that HMIE published earlier this year. So there aren't any great surprises in there. This is information that's been available to the sector for some time. And in fact, the guidance encourages you to take quite a simple approach to planning, to learn from and reflect from what's gone before, to identify what you're trying to achieve, and to put in place actions to achieve these things. And importantly, to do this in partnership and in collaboration with others, including your CLD target audience. The messages coming from the CLD plans report and the review of inspection findings are fairly consistent. One of the key ones is about how you can use data to drive your priority setting, and another about self-evaluation and doing this jointly with partners to plan for improvement. So this brings me back to my earlier point about hopes and aspirations for CLD policy. I'd like the national CLD strategies and the CLD planning guidance to support you in your efforts for collaboration locally by leading by example at a national level. I'd say that as a CLD policy team, about at least 30% of our time is spent speaking to others across the government about how CLD policy practice can deliver their ambitions too. And that's reflective of what Alan was saying before, and also what Mick was saying. There's a lot of different influences in the CLD world, and a lot of people working in the CLD world trying to achieve things in the same way, but not necessarily identifying as part of the CLD family. But our work across government has led to a few successes, accessing some funding from other portfolio areas, particularly recently in amongst the COVID pandemic, and also getting seats at the table for CLD stakeholders in key decision-making platforms that the government hosts. So finally, this brings me to the Lifelong Learning Framework, which was a programme for government commitment this year. The Minister's made quite clear that he would like to see CLD better integrated and understood across the wider education system. So the Lifelong Learning Framework's our opportunity as a policy team to lead this process. And it's my aim that we use this opportunity to cohere and promote CLD, adult learning, including ESOL and literacies, youth work and community development and empowerment through the framework. We have to do more at this stage with you and with national stakeholders to explore how this is going to work. We're still in the early stages thinking, but our starting point, as in true CLD style, is always what outcomes we would like to achieve through this framework. And in brief, what we'd be looking to do is to better join up learning across people's lives, to increase the profile of community-based learning as a vehicle for delivering this and for delivering improved outcomes for our most excluded learners. A better understanding and recognition of the full impact of CLD practice across policy areas, so not just education, but health, as we've been talking about before, and justice. And also to get better support for professional CLD learning. That's really important. And of course, one of the reasons why we're all part of the CLD Standards Council. So I'm going to pause there because I've probably done at least 5 minutes, but I hope that's quite a helpful summary of the work. Am I getting a death stare? I didn't check for the death stare from Kirsty there. Hopefully that's quite a useful summary of the work that we're doing just now and what we're hoping to achieve through that. And I just pass now to Karen, Kirsty.
That's great, Nicola. Thank you very much. And there will be time, as I say, when we go into coffee after this to have a chance to think about some of the things that Nicola's said. But Nicola, you'll be here until about 11 o'clock, I think. So we'll be able to respond to some questions if anyone has anything they want to put in the chat for now. But for now, over to Karen for her input.
Hello. Please don't be put off by the PowerPoint. It's to keep me right. I'm going to talk about impact, and I'm going to talk about impact in 2020 and 2021, which means I'm going to be looking a bit at COVID and what's happened. Most models of community learning and development look at 3 levels: that we work with the individual, the community, and systems and power. So a nice picture of working with the individual, the holding hands, and that's what we do, enhancing self-esteem, empowerment, and the relationships. The community, helping people work together to achieve common goals. That's the picture of people sweeping. And then systems and power is about working to keep things moving, to keep things going round, like the roundabout. And I think we're less good at this. I think we're very good at working with individuals, we're good at working with the community, but when it comes to systems and power and looking at things like poverty, we're not quite so good. And models of community resilience, which is what I want to speak about today, frequently refer to the individual, the community, and systems and power. And community resilience is what we're going to need in 2020. It's so important. But I do have a very good example of working with systems and power, which is from the Workers' Educational Association, which I'm associated with. And they do some work on political literacy, helping people in the local community to do their own work about poverty and issues that matter to them. So I'll just throw that in for you. So when we're thinking about impact, we generally think about statistics and stories. And frequently we're thinking about statistics and stories, we think about scale, quality, and significance. And I've been doing some research in Fife, where we interviewed more than 80 people from vulnerable and disadvantaged backgrounds about COVID, and 30 or more community groups within the third sector about their experience of COVID. And looking at scale, quality, and significance, the work of CLD has been absolutely phenomenal in terms of scale, which I'm sure you all know, quality in terms of meeting people's needs, and significance, which is the harder one, about making a difference and making change occur. So the third sector and councils have been working fantastically in 2020 to respond to the pandemic. And anyone who knows me will know that the research I've done about COVID-19 has been very much looking at stories, the stories of people and their lives. And the main finding, which won't come as any surprise to any of you, is that mental health and well-being is a key issue that's emerging from that stuff, and also the need for community resilience. Now, when planning officers in councils are thinking of community resilience, they think about jobs and they think about the environment and they think about managing floods and things like that. But one thing that's really important is the social resilience, which is the glue that holds communities together. And that's where we come in. We are the glue that holds communities together. Social resilience is absolutely crucial to thinking about plans for the future, thinking about recovery, and thinking about how we're going to make communities able to cope with the mental health and wellbeing issues that have emerged. And social resilience is, there's a lot written about social resilience, but the thing that I think is most important about social resilience is it's about coping capacities and the ability to cope with and overcome all kinds of adversities, which we're very good at helping people do that in the individual level. Then social resilience is about adaptive capacities, helping people learn from past experiences and adjust themselves to the future. That's absolutely crucial for us and is very, very closely linked to the educational dimension of CLD. Then finally, transformative capacities, craft sets of institutions that foster welfare and sustainable societal robustness. That's what I think we're not quite so good at. And it's about making sure the systems and structures are right. So looking to the future, CLD, I think, needs to be thinking about the scale, quality, and significance of our work. I've got this lovely picture of birds flying, and that's us flying into the future, looking at the scale, quality, and significance of what we do to respond to COVID-19. And one of the things that I learned from the research in Fife that I did about COVID-19 was the fact that a lot of the people at grassroots level in the community teams felt that the response to COVID had been top down by policy officers who didn't know the local community, and things were delivered at local level like food parcels without thinking about the local community. So policy was separated from the practice at the local level, which is something I think has been said by other people, and it will be interesting to think about what Nicola thinks about that. So we need to think about the scale, quality and significance of our work, but we need to think about it in terms of community resilience and responding. And Kirsty was very kind to mention the book that was written by 5 of us who are members of the CLD Standards Council. And one of the things that we thought was important that links to this policy issue is that we're not, because our roles are so complex and multifaceted, we're not very good at thinking about, at expressing what we do well to policymakers. And we thought very hard in the book about what this meant for some people. Some people are well able to do this, but some people aren't in our experience. And we thought that we needed to reconsider our identity and try and express this complexity and multifacetedness of the profession that we work in. And we thought that the way of doing this is to think about the purpose at the 3 levels, to think that we work with issues identified, interpreted and managed at the local level. But we're working on issues with national and global significance, like poverty. We're working with short-term and longitudinal effect, so it matters now, but it also matters to the future of communities. We're working with people at all levels of society. And we're sustaining relationships to effect change that's in the interests of the individual, the community, and wider society. Again, those 3 levels. So those are the views, not just of me, but of Sue Briggs, Kirsty Forrester, Ed Garrett, and Catherine McKay, who are the co-authors of the book. And you don't get away without the advert, which it's got the references, but also the reference to the book. And as Kirsty very kindly said, there's a 30% discount for it if you get back before the end of December. But I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Nicola and Karen. Karen, you had said there that you thought there might be, you'd be interested to hear Nicola's views on a couple of your points. Do you want to?
Yes, I was very interested in what Nicola had to say about getting more involved in policy. And I wondered if she had any ideas about how individuals working at the local level can influence policy a bit more.
Can influence national policy, Karen?
Yes, and local policy, yes.
I suppose it's about plugging in, for me, it's about plugging into when you're evaluating at a local level what the impact is you're having on an individual or on an individual community. It's about having an eye on how that reads up into national performance measurements. And I think that the reports that I referred to before, particularly the review of inspection findings for CLD, found that that's something that's not done particularly well. And I think that was what you had said in your talk there, that people aren't always great at articulating that. So I suppose partly it's our job at national policy level to help make those links more explicit. So for example, working with the National Performance Framework, if anybody's familiar with that, when you look at it, you can clearly see where CLD practice makes those big data shifts, if you like. So if we're talking about people with low or no qualifications, we know that CLD practice sits at one end and might not develop the qualifications that then become measured at that level, but bring people into that route where those statistics begin to change and develop. And that unfortunately often gets forgotten, and it's a story that's not told. So I guess by making sure that when you're undertaking practice, when you're monitoring and evaluating it, you're not just looking at that individual level, but trying to tell the story of how that then impacts on the bigger high profile changes that as a country we want to see through our national performance framework. And CLD planning and the integration of that is key. It's key to that. So the CLD plan has to talk to those big data shifts that you're trying to achieve, and making, articulating how CLD practice plays its role in that.
Yes. I'm very much hoping that the CLD plans that people produce next year will have something about community resilience in them, thinking about this, how the communities are going to recover, and thinking about the absolutely central role of CLD in that. So I'm hoping that there's a thinking going to go on at the 3 levels about how this can be managed, which should be very exciting.
So we don't seem to have any pressing questions in the chat. I'll open up in case anyone wants to just jump in on screen just now. Anybody want to ask anything in particular? Whether you do or whether you don't, we've got a couple of questions for you, so you don't escape either way.
I think Pat's got her hand up there, Kirsty. I don't know who you can see on your screen.
Thank you very much, and I'll definitely buy your book. I've made a note. I just wanted to ask about individuals and their coping capacities. Have they identified a range of learning and development skills and that they would aspire to have? Did that come out of some of the research?
Something that came out of the research was the absolute need for befriending and peer support, which goes with learning, which goes with being in arts and crafts classes, which goes in skills development classes, and very much a need for employment, because people were being put out of work, and that was an issue. So a need for employment skills. So there was massive need for learning.
That's really, I've a volunteer for a gardening program to help people develop gardening skills, and I'm also tailoring or designing a sewing skill at the minute for a workshop post-pandemic, and there's people are wanting to do that kind of thing to develop their self-confidence. And
gardening came out really strongly.
Yeah, gardening's come strong, yeah. Yeah,
it came out really strongly as something people were doing to survive during COVID, and if they had a garden. And it was also something that people felt very strongly that they would like to do in the future if they didn't have a garden, was volunteering.
That's interesting, because I worked in Fife in the mining industry, and one of the things that miners did, I just lived next door, was have gardens that made a big contrast to them being underground. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Any other questions or comments?
Hi, Mick again. I'm interested in how the guidance for CLD plans was developed this time round. And my memory is that we were quite involved in that last time round. And I think for us from Scottish Community Development Centre, I think we see 2 key areas that need to be developed in the plans this year. One is a much stronger response to the new statutory framework for community engagement, which is not part of the CLD regulations, but actually comes from the Community Empowerment Act. And secondly, how we respond to this resilience agenda. But in the past, I seem to remember there was discussions with stakeholder organisations about how to develop the guidance on the plans. And I'm not really aware what happened this time round. I was just wondering how that worked.
So Mick, that was developed in partnership with the CLD leadership group, predominantly CLD Manager Scotland, as a sector representative, were the most heavily involved in that. The CLD guidance does reference the need for community empowerment and the Community Empowerment Act, but you're right, this time there hasn't been the huge amount of involvement that there was last time around, simply because of circumstances. However, because it doesn't represent such a huge directive shift, and actually relies more on the pieces of work like the review of the CLD plans from last time around, which the stakeholder group were involved in. I think potentially yourself or someone else from CLD Standards Council were involved in that piece of work. So because it's based on that sort of evidence base, if you like, it at least mitigates some of the fact that we've not been able to go out and do the normal level of stakeholder engagement around it.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Mick and Nicola.